Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Laubach. Thank you for joining me in this podcast. Now, I'm calling this a podcast, but I will be placing on the screen some items for you to follow along with. But this will be primarily a listening exercise. In this podcast, I'm going to go over what life was like in colonial America. So when we talk about colonial America, we are talking about the 1600s to the late 1700s. And this would be in the British colonies, or think the original 13 colonies. Now, the first part will be about life in general, and then the second part will be about what life was like living in the colonies and the differences between the poor and the wealthy and their experiences. Now, of course, a lot of this is generalizations, and not everybody lived this way or had this experience, so we should keep that in mind. But I tried to keep it as generally accurate as possible. So here we go. Let's take a close look at what life was like for the colonists. The British colonies were considered Neo-European. So what is Neo-European? It refers to regions outside of Europe that were settled predominantly by Europeans and developed social, cultural, and economic structures resembling those in Europe. These regions often included areas where European settlers became the dominant population, replicating European-style institutions, agricultural practices, and societal norms. The concept is particularly relevant to the discussion of colonialism and the spread of European culture globally. So where did these colonists come from that were living in the British colonies? The people who settled in the British colonies in America came from a diverse array of regions within Europe. Predominantly, they hailed from England, but significant numbers also arrived from Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Beyond the British Isles, settlers included Germans, particularly in Pennsylvania, Dutch in New York, originally New Amsterdam, and Swedes in parts of Delaware and New Jersey, and in the eastern part of Pennsylvania. Additionally, French Huguenots, fleeing religious persecution in France, settled in various colonies, including South Carolina and New York. Now, of course, there were many Africans living in the British colonies as well. Most of them were enslaved and brought here against their will. I have another video in YouTube that specifically talks about the experience of Africans that lived in the British colonies during the 16 and 1700s. This mix of ethnicities and cultures contributed to the rich colonial society, blending different traditions, languages, and customs into the developing American identity. So what was life typically like for colonists? Most colonists lived on small farms. Agriculture was the backbone of colonial life. Families worked from sunrise to sunset, tending to crops like corn, wheat, and tobacco, depending on where you lived. Farming was not just a job, but a way of life that required every family member's participation. And many colonial families were awfully large, with lots of kids. The heart of colonial homes was the kitchen, where meals were prepared over an open hearth. Cooking was a labor-intensive process, often involving baking bread, churning butter, and preserving food for winter months. In towns, marketplaces bustled with activity. Here, colonists could buy and sell goods, from fresh produce to handmade tools and clothes. Markets were also social hubs where people exchanged news and gossip. This also happened at the local tavern. Religion played a central role in the lives of the American colonists, shaping their communities, governance, and daily activities. It was a major force in uniting people and establishing social norms, serving as a source of comfort and guidance in an uncertain and often harsh environment in the colonies. For many settlers, especially those in New England, the quest for religious freedom, the Puritans, was a primary motivation for migration to the New World. So in New England, think the Puritans and the Pilgrims. Churches became focal points of colonial towns, not only as places of worship, but also as venues for public meetings and decision-making. Religious beliefs deeply influenced colonial laws and educational systems, with many schools established to ensure that children could read the Bible. Additionally, the religious diversity among different colonies fostered a spirit of tolerance and laid the groundwork for the principle of freedom of religion that would later be enshrined in the Constitution in the First Amendment. Overall, religion was integral to the cultural and social fabric of colonial America, helping to shape its identity and future development. Skilled artisans and craftsmen were essential to colonial economies. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and cobblers provided necessary services and goods, contributing to the colony's growth and sustainability. Despite the hard work, colonists found time for leisure and play. Children enjoyed simple games like hoop rolling and marbles, while adults might gather for dances and social events. Now let's talk a little bit about the press in colonial America. It was a cornerstone of communication, spreading news, ideas, and information across the colonies in the form of newspapers and what would become known as pamphlets. Printing in colonial times was a labor-intensive process. Printers used hand-operated presses to produce newspapers, books, and pamphlets. Each page was set by hand, letter by letter, using movable type. Newspapers were a primary source of news and information. Titles like the Boston Newsletter and the Pennsylvania Gazette became widely read. These publications included local news, advertisements, editorials, political cartoons, and reprints of articles from other colonies or Europe. Pamphlets were another important medium. These short publications often contained political essays or editorials, sermons, or other topical writings. They were easily distributed and could quickly spread revolutionary ideas. Benjamin Franklin was one of the most influential printers and publishers of the colonial period. His newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, and his popular Poor Richard's Almanac had a significant impact on colonial society. The press also played a crucial role in the fight for freedom of speech. The 1735 trial of John Peter Zenger, a printer accused of libel against the colonial government of New York, was a landmark case. His acquittal established a precedent for the right to criticize government officials. I have a video about the Zenger case on YouTube if you want to check that out separately. The press in colonial America was more than just a means of communication. It was a vital part of social and political fabric. It empowered colonists with information, fueled the exchange of ideas, and laid the groundwork for the freedoms we cherish today. As the colonies developed, many colonists were avid readers, and ideas were able to exchange relatively quickly. Now, moving on to what life was like for poorer and wealthier colonists. Life in colonial America varied greatly depending on one's social and economic status. The difference between the poor and the wealthy were stark, affecting every aspect of daily life. Let's explore these disparities and how it shaped experience. In the early 1600s, the chief concern of most colonists was economic survival. People had neither time nor resources to pursue elaborate leisure activities or create works of art or literature. However, as the generations went on, colonial population had grown and matured to the point that arts and other aspects of civilized living and cultural living could flourish, at least among the world of to-do planners in the South and wealthy merchants in the North. The poor in colonial America often lived in small, cramped homes made of wood and thatch. These houses typically had one or two rooms and minimal furnishing. Survival required hard work and resourcefulness. In contrast, the wealthy lived in large, well-appointed homes made of brick or stone. These houses featured multiple rooms, fine furniture, and decorations imported from Europe. Wealthy families had the luxury of employing servants to manage household chores and labor. Poor families often relied on subsistence farming, growing enough food to feed themselves with little left over to sell. They worked long hours in the field and had to be self-sufficient, oftentimes making their own clothes and tools. The wealthy had diverse sources of income, including large-scale farming, trade, business ventures. They could afford to import luxury goods such as fine china, silk, and spices. Their wealth allowed them to access better education and leisure activities. Education for poor children was often limited, if not existent at all. Many just learned basic skills from their parents and had to contribute to the family's labor from a young age, not leaving a lot of room for any formal schooling. Now, formal schooling in the colonies, if available, was a rare luxury. Education, however, was valued, though opportunity varied widely. A 1674 New England law made towns of over 50 families have to have a publicly funded school for boys. The middle colonies had schools, but they were often church-sponsored or private. Education in southern colonies were provided by the parents, and those that were wealthy were able to get tutors. Now, higher education in the colonies. Harvard was the first colonial college and was founded in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1636 in order to give candidates for the ministry a proper theological and scholarly education. Two other earlier colleges were William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, which opened in 1694, and Yale in Connecticut, which opened in 1701. One thing that the wealthy and the poor in the colonies had in common was that faith was very important. Churches were central to community life, providing spiritual guidance and a sense of belonging. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast on colonial life in the British colonies between the 1600s and the 1700s. Thanks for joining me and have a great rest of the day.